Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we're going to be creating the code system. Now, hopping directly in the studio, the first thing that we're going to do is start creating the GUI. So we're going to go inside of the Star GUI, and we're actually going to duplicate another GUI, which has a lot of the similar components that we're already going to be using for this one. Now, the GUI that we're going to duplicate is the random gift one, so we're going to select that and then hit Control D. Now that we've duplicated it, let's go ahead and rename this to be called Codes. And then we're going to enable it. Cool, so now that we can see it, let's go ahead and start working on the frame. Now, in order to begin working on the frame, we actually have to go inside of it and delete the UI aspect ratio constraint. And now that we've done that, we can easily resize it. Now, I want to make this a little bit taller, and then I also want to make it a little bit wider as well. So let's go ahead and stretch this out a little bit, and then let's go ahead and recenter it. Cool, now that we've done that, let's go ahead and update the background color of this frame. I want to go with a dark blue, so I'm going to go ahead and grab the color from right there, and I might even make it a little bit darker, so something like that. Then what we're going to do is select the title, select the reward, select the two gift image labels, and then select the click BG, and we're actually going to delete all of those. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and update the title. Let's go ahead and update the text color to be white. Now, for the text of this, we actually want it to say codes. Now I'm going to go ahead and make it just a tiny bit smaller. Then what we're going to do is duplicate the title text label, and we're going to rename it to be called subtitle. Then I'm going to go ahead and update the text of this text label as well. Now, what I set the text to was use codes for epic rewards. Join our group and follow our Twitter at MonzterDEV for more. So, of course, your standard little message directing people where to get codes from. Now, as you saw, I'm going to drag this down a little bit, and then I'm going to enlarge it a little bit as well. So we'll go ahead and adjust its sizing. Cool. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and update the collect button. Instead of this being called collect, we actually want to rename this to be called confirm. We're also going to update the background color of this and make it a brighter green. Then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and update the text of the title text label to say confirm. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and readjust the sizing of this button, and we're going to make it significantly smaller. Now I think that sizing's pretty good. Let's go ahead and center this horizontally as well. And cool, that button's looking all good. Now, next what we're going to do is throw a frame inside of here, and we're going to rename this to be called text box BG. Of course, BG standing for background. Then we'll go ahead and convert the size to scale. And then let's go ahead and resize this. Now we're going to want to horizontally center this. And along with that, I'm going to stretch this frame out to pretty much be the same width of the subtitle. So now that I've resized that, let me go ahead and center this horizontally. There we go. Next, what I'll do is go ahead and update the background color. We're going to go with a nice blue color. Then what we're going to do is inside of here, we're going to create a brand new text box. Now, of course, let's go ahead and make the size scale. Now for the actual size of this, I'm going to go with about 0.98 on the X and then 0.8 on the Y. And now that we've done that, let's also center this as well. Cool. And now that we've centered that, let's go ahead and start updating some of the text properties. So I'm going to go ahead and set the text property to test just so that we can visually see the text on screen right now. Then what I'm going to do is actually set the background color to 1, and now I'll go back to the text properties. So we're going to want to change this color to actually be white. We'll also make text scaled. Then let's go ahead and adjust the font. We'll set that to a Gotham. Then let's go ahead and adjust the placeholder text, and we're actually going to say enter code ... And so that we can actually see the placeholder text, we're going to go ahead and set the text property to blank. And now that we've done that, we can actually see the placeholder text. And now that we can see that placeholder text, we're actually going to go ahead and adjust the color. Now I'm just going to make the color a white, and you might want to put some stroke on the text as well, so you can feel free to adjust that. Anyways, now that we've done that, we're actually all good to go with that text box. Although to give it some finishing touches, I'm going to go ahead and grab this UI corner and paste it directly inside of that text box as well. And now that we have a UI corner in here, I think the corner radius of it is actually pretty good, so I'm not going to adjust that at all. Now the last thing that we need to do for this frame is actually create an exit button, and I'm just going to go ahead and grab our exit button from the Rebirth GUI. So I'm going to go ahead, copy, and paste that inside of here. And now that I've pasted it inside of here, let's go ahead and resize it a little bit. Cool. And I think that sizing is pretty good, but now I just need to position it towards the top right corner. So I resized the button a little bit more, and I also repositioned it, and now I think the exit button does look pretty good. Now with all that being said, we're actually done creating the GUI. It was a relatively easy one. So now that we've finished creating the GUI, let's go ahead and start scripting this. In order to start scripting this, we'll go ahead and start off by creating the config module. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and we're going to go ahead and create a brand new module script. We'll of course rename this module script to be called codes, and we'll also rename the module variable inside of here as well. And now the first thing that we're going to do inside of here is actually create the config. So we're going to go ahead and create the config variable. We're going to say codes.config, and then that's going to be equal to a table. Now for the keys of this table, we're going to be using strings, which will be the actual code that the player can redeem. Now I'm going to make all of our keys surrounded in brackets so that we can use strings and include spaces and other things inside of that string if we want to. So our first code is going to be test, and we're going to set that equal to a blank table. Now also, just to show you what I mean by using these brackets instead of just writing out the string, if I wanted to make a code called test code with a space in between there, let's go ahead and delete those brackets, and we see that we're getting an error. The reason that we're getting an error is because you're not supposed to use actual quotation marks as keys, so that gives us an error right there. And now because there's a space in between these two words, this is an invalid key as well, so we have to either delete one of those words, or we could combine those into a single word, keyword using an underscore. So that's why we're surrounding our strings inside of brackets. Now, to be fair, we're 51 episodes into this. So Monster, why are you even explaining that? You know, that's a thought that just popped up into my head. Is anyone actually benefiting from me actually explaining that? I mean, I imagine it's possible for you to make it 51 episodes and not realize that exactly. But I also feel like we've used this multiple times throughout the series that I've probably already touched on this and everybody already knows about it. I don't know. Let me know what you think down below in the comment section. Anyways, getting back to scripting, for the value, we're going to have a dictionary. And inside of here, we're going to have a couple of different properties. So the first property that we're going to have is going to be called expire, which is going to be equal to a number. And that number is actually the Unix time code for when this code expires. Now, again, re-explaining things that I've already explained earlier in the series, I'd recommend using the Unix timestamp website to generate the timestamp for when you want your code to expire. So to give you a quick example, let's say that I'm creating a code for Christmas, okay? Let's also just say that today is like December 24th. And let's just say that I only want this code to be available for a single day. So once Christmas is over, I want the code to expire. Well, of course, what we would do is set the month to 12 because that's December. Then for the day, we're going to go ahead and set this to 26 because we want it to expire on the 26th. Then for the hour, minute, and seconds, we could just set these all to 0. So as soon as the time changes and it becomes the 26th of December, that is when the code will actually expire. And then all I have to do is click convert and then copy the timestamp directly from here, go back to my script and paste it inside of here. Cool. So now we set when we want this code to expire. We also have to add one more property to here as well, which is going to be called reward. And that's going to be equal to a table itself. Inside of this table, we're going to have a property called type, which we're going to say is clicks. And then we're also going to have another property inside of here called amount, which is going to be equal to a number. And we're going to set this equal to 1 million. So I don't think the reward table needs much of an explanation. I feel like we've used this multiple times throughout the series as well. But basically we create this reward table, then we could specify the type, whether if we want to give the player gems, clicks, pets, or even other things like that, we can go ahead and include all the reward info that we need right here. Cool. And with all that being said, we've now created our first code. Let's go ahead and copy and paste that. This time we'll create another code, which is called a test code. And we're going to make this code expired just so that we can see what happens if we try to use an expired code. Now the reward for this is going to be gems. And we're just going to give the player 999. Now the reward doesn't really matter because it is expired, but let's go ahead and copy and paste this one more time. Now I'm going to leave the expired test code down here and work on this one, which is going to be like another working code just so we can test rewarding gems. But this code is going to be gems with a capital G and a capital M. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I plan on showing you how to make the codes not case sensitive. But of course, if you do want to have case sensitive codes, I'll also show you that as well. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and update the expire property here to the same that we have for the test code up here, just so that the code is not expired and I can actually redeem it. Anyways, now that we've created 3 codes, let's go ahead and start creating some functions, and then we can get on to implementing this throughout the entire game. So the first function that we're going to create is called getValidCode, which is going to accept a test code, which is a string. Then what we're going to do is loop through all the codes inside the config. So we're going to say for code and then underscore because we're not actually using the code config here in codes.config do. Now we want to check if the test code is the same as the code. And if both of these match, then we're going to go ahead and return the code because we did find a valid code. Now I also mentioned making our codes not case sensitive. And where we actually would do that is inside of this function right here. Now you might think making them case insensitive is actually a difficult task, but literally it's as simple as just using 2 methods. So all we're going to do is use the upper method on the test code string and then also use the upper method on the code string. So all this does is capitalize every single letter inside of both these strings. And now with this check, the codes are now case insensitive. Personally, I think case insensitive codes provide a better user experience, but of course, if you want them to be case sensitive, then you could just remove using the upper method. Anyways, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and create the second function. This is going to be called isCodeExpired, and we're going to go ahead and once again get the test code, which of course is going to be a string. And now the first thing that we're going to do is get the actual code, and we're going to do that by using the getValidCode function that we just created. So we're going to create a variable called code, which is going to be equal to codes.getValidCode, and we're going to pass through the test code. Now, if we don't actually get a code, then we're going to stop the function right there. Then what we're going to do is create a variable called codeConfig, which is going to be equal to codes.config, and then we're going to index the config table with a specific code. And now to check if the code is expired, all we have to do is return if the current time, which is os.time. So if the current time is greater than the codeConfig.expire, then we know that the code is expired because the current time is after or greater than the expire time. And now that we've created that function, we have one more to go. This is going to be a very simple function, and it's going to be called isCodeAlreadyRedeemed. This is going to accept the code, which is again going to be a string, as well as the player's data. Now, all we're going to do is simply return data. Then we're going to get the codes table, which we have not added to the player's data yet, but this is a sneak peek. And then we're going to index that with the specific code. So of course, since we haven't added the player's data yet, what we're going to do for storing this on the player's data is we're simply going to create a table called codes, and then inside of that table, we're going to store every single code as a key, and for the value, it's going to be a boolean, depending on if the player has actually redeemed the code or not. And now with that function created, we're actually all done inside of this config. And now, just speaking of the player's data, let's go ahead and actually update that. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, and open up the template module script. Inside of here, we're of course going to want to go ahead and get the codes config. Now that we've gotten that, let's go ahead and copy and paste our standard for loop. We're going to rename this variable to be called default codes. Now this for loop's also a little bit different as well. For our key, it's actually going to be the code, while for the value, it'll be the code config, but we're not going to use that, so we'll throw an underscore there. Then for the table that we want to loop through, it's actually the codes config.config. So the config table. Then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and index the default codes table with the specific code, and then we're going to set that equal to false, because by default, the player should not have redeemed a single code. And now that we've added all the codes to that table, what we're then going to do is come down to the player's template variable. We'll go ahead and create a codes table inside of here and set that equal to the default codes table. And with that being said, we've now updated the player's data, so we can exit out of that script. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and add in the networking. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the remotes folder. Inside of here, we're going to create a brand new remote function, which is going to be called redeem code. Along with that remote function, we're also going to create a remote event, which is going to be called update code. And now with that networking created, we can go ahead and start scripting this on the server side. So we're going to go inside of the server script service, and we're going to go ahead and create a brand new script. Now, we're going to rename this script to be called codes. Then inside of here, we're going to want to create a variable for the server script service, as well as the replicated storage. We'll also create a variable for the codes config, so require replicated storage.configs.codes. We also want to get the player data manager as well, so we're going to require server script service.playerdata.manager. In addition to that, we also want to create a variable for the remotes folder inside of the replicated storage, so replicated storage.remotes. Then what we're going to do is create a function, which is going to be called redeem code. Now this function is going to accept a player, of course, of the player type, as well as the test code, which is going to be a string. Now, before we even add the logic to this function, we can also hook it up to the networking as well. So we're going to go inside of the remotes folder, and we're going to actually listen to the redeem code remote function that we created earlier. So we're going to say .on server invoke, and we're going to set the callback function equal to redeem code. So whenever this remote function is used from the client, it's going to go ahead and run this function. And from this function, we plan on returning something to the client, depending on if they were able to redeem the code or not. Now, the first thing that we're going to do inside of here is check if the code that's been provided to us is even a real code or not. So in order to do this, we're going to use the code to config and then get valid code, and we'll pass through the test code. Now, if we don't get any code back from that, then we're going to go ahead and return invalid. Then what we're going to do is check if the code is expired. So we're going to create a variable called isExpired, which again, we're going to use the code config.isCodeExpired, and then we're going to go ahead and pass through the code. Now, if the code is expired, then we're going to go ahead and return expired and stop the function right there. Now that we've checked if the code is valid, and if it's expired, we then want to check if the player has redeemed it or not. So let's go ahead and get the player's profile. And of course, we need to use the player data manager for that. So .profiles, index that with the player to get the player's profile. If we don't get the profile, then we're just going to go ahead and return end and stop the function right there entirely, because we should never actually get that error, but just in case we do want to stop the function right there. Next, we want to check if the code has been redeemed. So we'll create a variable called isRedeemed. And how will we determine if it's been redeemed or not? Well, we're actually going to use the isCodeAlreadyRedeemed function that we created earlier. So we'll pass through the code as well as the player's profile data. Now, if the code has already been redeemed, then we want to stop the function right there and also return already redeemed. So now that we've ran through all these different checks, we now know that the player should redeem this code and they should be rewarded for it. So we're going to create a variable called reward, which is going to be equal to codes config. We're going to use that config table. Then we're going to index this with the specific code, and then we're going to get the reward property of that. Then we'll create a variable for the reward type as well as the reward amount. So reward type is of course equal to reward.type, and the reward amount is of course equal to the reward.amount. Awesome. And now that we've gotten both of those, what we're going to do is check what the reward type is. So if the reward type is clicks, then we need to handle rewarding clicks a specific way. So we're going to say player data, adjust clicks, we'll pass through the player, and we'll pass through the reward amount as well. Then we'll say else if, and now if the reward type equals gems, then we'll go ahead and reward the player some gems. Cool. And now that we've handled actually rewarding the player, let's go ahead and also update the player's data, tracking that they have redeemed the code. So inside of the player's profile, we're going to go ahead and go inside of the data table. We'll then go into the codes table, index that with the specific code, and then set the value of that equal to true. Now that we've updated the player's data, we also have to replicate that to the client. So we're going to go ahead and use the update code remote event that we created earlier. We'll go ahead and fire client. pass through the player, as well as passing through the code. And the last thing that we're going to do is, because this is a remote function, if the player does successfully redeem the code, we're going to go ahead and return the word success. Awesome. And with all that being said, we're actually completely finished on the server side. So we can go ahead and close out of that script. Now, before we begin scripting this on the client side, let's go ahead and actually update the state manager. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the client folder, and open up the state module script. We're then going to go all the way down to the bottom. Then we'll go ahead and copy and paste the last remote. The remote that we're going to be using here is called update code. For the parameters of this function, we are going to accept a code, which is going to be a string. Now, to update the player's data, we're going to go inside of the player data table, inside of the codes table, and then we're going to index that with a specific code, and we're going to set that code equal to true because we have redeemed that code. And that's all that we have to do for the state manager. Very simple. Now, next we're going to begin scripting this on the client side. So we're going to go inside of the star player, inside of the star player scripts, inside of the GUI folder, and we're going to create a brand new local script inside of here, which we'll rename to be called codes. Now I'm going to go into our pet bank script just so that I can get a bunch of the variables that we're already going to need. So we'll copy all of these variables and paste them directly inside of here. Now, realistically, the only ones that we actually need are the replicated storage as well as the player service. Then we do need the state manager, but we don't need any of that. We do need the remotes variable, but it should just be set to the remotes folder and not the pets folder inside the remotes folder. Then we need the player and player GUI variables as well as the GUI. And we can also use the frame as well. But we do want to update the GUI variable and set that string to codes because we're looking for the GUI named codes. Anyways, to continue on creating some variables, we're going to go ahead and create our next variable called exit, which of course is the exit button inside of the frame. We'll also create a variable for the confirmation button, which is inside of the frame as well, so frame.confirm. And then we'll create a variable for the text box as well, which is inside of the frame, inside of the text box BG frame, and then we have the text box itself. Cool. Now we also want to create 3 constants as well. The first one that we're going to create is called text box text color default, and we're going to set this to a color3.fromRGB, and we're going to actually set this to a white color. Now, what this variable is going to be used for is what the text color of the text box actually looks like when the player is simply typing in their code. We're going to have 2 more variables, which is basically going to have the same name, except instead of default, it's going to be success and fail, and those colors are going to be green and red because we're going to update the text color if the player was able to redeem the code successfully or if they were unable to. So then what we can do is go ahead and copy and paste this. This next one is going to be called success. And then I'm just going to paste this a third time, and this is going to be called fail. So for the success color, we're going to go with a green. And then for the fail color, we're of course going to go with a red. Cool, so now we have all of our colors made, but I did actually misspell this variable. I said fail instead of fail, so let's fix that. Now this GUI is quite simple, and it doesn't really require us to do too much scripting. Realistically, when we take all the fancy stuff away from it, all we really have to do is listen for when the player clicks on the confirm button. And when they click on the confirm button, we then need to do something. So let's go ahead and create a function for this logic. This is actually going to be called redeem code, and it's not going to have any parameters. Now, actually, one more thing that I actually completely forgot. Along with the state manager, we also need the codes config as well. So let's create a variable for that. Anyway, going back inside of our function, the first thing we're going to do is create a variable called code. And using our codes config, we're going to go ahead and use the getValidCode function. Now, for the code that we want to pass through to here, we're actually going to use the text of our text box because that text is whatever the player has typed in to the text box. Now, the first thing we're going to do is check if the code was valid or not. So we'll create a variable called isInvalid, which is simply equal to not code. Now, if the code's invalid, then we actually want to stop the function right there. But before we stop the function here, we also want to update the text box as well to display to the player that it was an invalid code. Now, before we do that, I want to finish implementing the rest of the logic in this function. So I'm simply just going to write a comment here that says invalid code, and we'll loop back to this in a minute. Now that we know that the code is valid, the next thing that we need to check is if the code has expired. Now, how do we check if the code is expired? Well, we of course use the isCodeExpired function that we created. Then we'll go ahead and pass through the code. Now, if the code is expired, we also want to visually notify the player as well. Wait a second. This is something that I've never seen before, so I had to pause for a second. But do you guys see the auto-completion that Roblox has actually just given us? I mean, it's honestly pretty accurate. Well, I shouldn't say it's mostly accurate, but part of it definitely is. Do you guys even need me to make these videos for you anymore? Or is Roblox just going to handle this all automatically? I'm just kidding. But realistically, I don't think I need to type this out myself. Basically, if the code is expired, then we want to stop the function again. And then we also want to notify the player that it has expired. So we'll just leave a comment there because we're not going to do that right now. Then after we know that the code is valid and it's not expired, we also want to check if the player has already redeemed it. And we're going to check that by using the isCodeAlreadyRedeemed function. And if the code is redeemed, then we want to notify the player of that, and we want to stop the function right there. After we've ran all of those checks, what we're then going to do is communicate to the server, hey, we want to redeem this code. So we're going to create a variable called result, which is going to be equal to remotes.redeem code. We're then going to invoke server and pass through the code. And now based off of the result that we get, we're then going to display this to the player as well. So let's go ahead and actually create the function for displaying this to the player. We're going to create a new function, which is going to be called visualize result. It's going to accept a message, which is a string, as well as success, which is a boolean. And we're going to use this boolean to determine if the code was redeemed successfully. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is update the text color of the text box. So we're going to say textbox.textcolor3 equals, if the code was successfully redeemed, then we'll of course use the success color. Otherwise, we'll use the fail color. In addition to the text color, we're also going to update the text of it as well. And we're going to set that equal to the message. So that's the entire visual display that we're going to perform for the player. Then we're going to use task.delay and we're going to wait 3 seconds. And after 3 seconds, we basically want to clear the text box out and make it look like the player never typed the code into it. Now, if a player is already typing the code out, then we don't want to reset the box as they're in the middle of typing this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to check if the text of the text box is equal to the message that was sent through to here. And if it's still equal to that, then we're going to go ahead and set the text of the text box equal to a blank string, effectively resetting it. And now with that being said, that's all we have to do for this function. So going back to our redeem code function, inside of here where we added all of these comments is actually where we're going to call that function. So let's go ahead and replace this comment with calling that function. We're going to say visualize result. For the message here, we're going to say invalid code. And was it successfully redeemed? No, so we're going to say false. Then we're going to go ahead and copy and paste this for the expired code. This time we'll say expired code and still pass through false. Or to make this look probably a little bit more natural, we'll say code expired instead. And then for the already redeemed code, we'll paste that inside of here. And this time we'll say code already redeemed. Then going down to the result, after we get the result, we're again going to go ahead and call the visualize result function. For the message, we're going to go ahead and just pass through the result. And to determine if it was successful or not, the result variable should actually equal success as the string. Cool. And that's all that we have to do for this function as well. Now, when are we going to use the redeem code function? Well, like I said, we're going to call this anytime we click the confirmation button. So we're going to say confirmation button, mouse button one click, connect, and then we're going to pass through the redeem code function. In addition to that, we also want to do something with the text box. Of the text box, we're going to listen to the input began event, and we're going to connect this to an anonymous function. Now, whenever this is called, we're actually going to set the text color to the default text color. So we're going to say textbox.textcolor3 equals textbox text color default. And now the reason that we're doing that is because up here we changed the color. And after 3 seconds, we could reset inside of here as well. But imagine if the player starts typing before those 3 seconds have expired, then the text color would still be a different color. So that's why we're just going to go ahead and set it to the default color anytime the player is typing in the text box. Now, the last thing that we have to do inside of here is actually script the exit button. And that's really simple. We're going to say exit.mouse button one click, connect that to an anonymous function, and then we're going to set the GUI to no longer be enabled. Okay, so of course Roblox's AI is not perfect. I knew I should not have trusted that AI. If it wasn't for that AI, we would not have made this mistake. I'm just saying, although there's still like a 20% chance we still would have made this mistake. Anyway, we need to include a second argument in this function. And what do we need to include? Well, of course, we need to include the player's data to see if they've already redeemed the code or not. And now that we've done that, we can go into our game and test this out. Now, if we look back at our code's config, 2 of these codes should work. One of them should give us clicks, the other should give us some gems, and then the test code should not be redeemable because it should already be expired. So let's go ahead and try the first code called test, and I'm going to go ahead and type this out, but I'm going to also use capital letters for some of them to show you that it should be case insensitive. Then we'll click confirm, and now that we've clicked confirm, we can see success right there, and we can also see that I was given those clicks. Now let's go ahead and try to use the test code again. Now we get the message code already redeemed. So that means that that's working perfectly. Let's then also try that test code, and when we try to do that, it says that that code's already expired. And the last code that we have to test is gems, so let's write that out in all lowercase, and now we can see that we have redeemed that, and we were given some gems. So this is all working perfectly. Now what I'm going to do to finish this off is go into the starter GUI and make this GUI no longer be enabled. In Clicking Simulator, the way that we enable this GUI is actually through the menu, which we have not scripted yet. But the menu is extremely simple. It'll probably take us 5 to 10 minutes to script all of that, but it contains a ton of other GUIs, so I plan on creating most of those before we create the menu GUI itself. Then we'll create the menu GUI and hook everything else up to it that we've already created. Anyways, with that being said, we now have a working code system.